In Boston's exclusive Beacon Hill, a 55-year-old Italian-American woman was about to face crushing humiliation. What started as Thanksgiving dinner took a shocking turn when her ex-husband's family delivered their brutal verdict. Helen Follies wasn't your typical divorced mother. For 20 years, she had navigated Boston's elite circles, known for her grandmother's legendary recipes and unbreakable spirit. When Margaret Whitmore declared, "You don't belong at this table," Helen had no idea she was walking into her life's defining moment. Her heartbroken departure would lead to creating Boston's most revolutionary restaurant, where everyone belongs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Helen Follies gripped the steering wheel of her 10-year-old Honda Civic as she turned onto Beacon Street, the familiar knot in her stomach tightening with each block. The pristine colonial mansions loomed like sentries on either side, their manicured lawns and wrought iron gates a stark reminder that she was entering foreign territory. 20 years ago, when she'd first married Richard, these streets had seemed like a fairy tale. Now they felt like a gauntlet. She pulled into the circular driveway of the Whitmore family estate, parking her modest car behind a gleaming Mercedes and a BMW that probably cost more than her annual salary from her part-time bookkeeping job. The tiramisu she'd spent 3 hours perfecting sat carefully balanced on the passenger seat next to a loaf of her grandmother's pain pugliese, wrapped in a tea towel that had belonged to Nonna Follies herself. These offerings felt pathetically small now, dwarfed by the grandeur of the 3-story mansion, with its perfect symmetry and autumn wreaths that probably cost more than Helen's monthly grocery budget. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing down her black dress. Her one good dress that she'd bought for Richard's work functions years ago. It still fit, though it felt different now. Everything felt different. The front door opened before she could ring the bell. Victoria Whitmore stood in the doorway, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, wearing what Helen recognized as a designer dress in muted burgundy that complemented the fall decorations perfectly. Victoria's smile was as polished as everything else about her. "Helen, so wonderful that you could make it." Victoria's tone carried the subtle edge that Helen had learned to recognize, warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Richard's in the study with Charles, and Margaret's holding court in the living room. You remember everyone, of course." Helen nodded, clutching her contributions. "I brought tiramisu and some bread." "I thought, how thoughtful." Victoria's gaze flicked to the humble offerings. "Though I should mention, our caterer prepared quite the spread. But I'm sure we can find somewhere to put these." The dismissal was gentle, but unmistakable. Helen followed Victoria through the marble foyer, past oil paintings of stern-faced Whitmore ancestors who seemed to judge her with their painted eyes. The house smelled of expensive candles and roasted turkey, nothing like the garlic and basil that always perfumed her own small apartment. In the living room, Margaret Whitmore Ashford sat in a wingback chair like a queen on her throne. At 73, she commanded attention effortlessly, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her pearls catching the light from the crystal chandelier. She was Richard's great-aunt, the family matriarch who'd never quite approved of her great-nephew's first marriage choice. "Helen, dear." Margaret's voice carried the particular tone of someone speaking to a child who'd tracked mud through the house. "How rustic you look. That dress brings back memories." Helen felt the familiar flush creep up her neck. She'd worn this dress to several family functions over the years, and Margaret never failed to remember. "Thank you for including me, Margaret." The children were so excited about spending Thanksgiving here. "Yes, well, children need stability, don't they?" "Consistency." Margaret's pale blue eyes swept over Helen with practiced assessment. "Speaking of which, how is that little job of yours going? Still doing books for that? What was it? Auto repair shop?" "I work for several small businesses," Helen replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "It's rewarding work." Margaret's laugh was crystalline and sharp. "I'm sure it keeps you busy, such dedication to commerce." Charles Whitmore Bennett, Victoria's cousin, appeared at Helen's elbow with a martini in hand. He was younger than Margaret but carried the same air of inherited superiority. "Helen, still living in that charming neighborhood of yours? The North End, wasn't it? So authentic. It's my home, Helen said simply. Of course it is. All that wonderful character, the way those old Italian families have held on to their traditions. It's almost like a museum, isn't it? Frozen in time. Helen felt the careful insult land. Charles wasn't commenting on her neighborhood's charm. He was marking it as quaint, outdated, something to be observed rather than lived in. She'd grown up on those narrow streets, where her grandmother had taught her to make sauce from scratch, and where neighbors still looked out for each other's children. But through Charles's eyes, her heritage became a curiosity, her traditions merely picturesque relics. Richard entered the room then, and Helen's heart gave its familiar lurch. Even after 3 years of divorce, seeing him still affected her. He was graying at the temples now, distinguished in his navy blazer, but his eyes still held the warmth that had first drawn her to him 22 years ago. That warmth dimmed slightly when he saw her. Helen. He kissed her cheek perfunctorily. You look nice. The hesitation was barely perceptible, but Helen caught it. She also caught Victoria's satisfied smile from across the room. Where are Emma and Tony? Helen asked. Tony's in the kitchen, fascinated by the chef's technique. Emma's helping Victoria with place settings. Richard's voice carried the forced cheerfulness she remembered from the worst days of their marriage. They'll be thrilled to see you. But before Helen could respond, Margaret's voice cut through the room. Richard, dear, you must tell Helen about the Wellington Academy. Such exciting news about Emma's application. Helen's stomach dropped. Wellington Academy? Richard's face flushed. It's just... We thought Emma might benefit from more challenging academics. Wellington has an excellent college placement record. Without consulting me? Helen's voice remained controlled, but she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Emma's doing beautifully at Boston Latin. Public school is fine for some children, Margaret interjected smoothly. But Emma has such potential, it would be a shame to see it, limited by circumstance. The words hung in the air like smoke. Helen understood perfectly. Emma's potential was being limited by her association with Helen, with their modest life in the North End, with everything that made them different from the Whitmores. Victoria glided over with a silver tray of canapés. These are from Le Bernardin's executive chef. He's doing our catering tonight. Helen, you simply must try one. Though I imagine they're quite different from what you're used to. Helen accepted the offering, tasting caviar and crème fraîche on delicate pastry. It was exquisite and completely foreign to her palate. It's lovely. I'm so glad you appreciate fine cuisine, Victoria said, her smile razor-sharp. It's so important to expand one's horizons, don't you think? To experience how the other half lives? The conversation continued around her, a careful dance of inclusion and exclusion. They asked about her work with the tone of someone inquiring about a hobby. They complimented her appearance with qualifiers that undermined the praise. They discussed restaurants in neighborhoods she couldn't afford, vacation destinations that required more money than she made in a year, cultural events that assumed a level of education and sophistication she'd never been given the opportunity to acquire. Emma appeared in the doorway, radiant in a navy dress that Helen didn't recognize, probably something Victoria had bought her. At 17, Emma was becoming a beauty, inheriting Richard's aristocratic bone structure, but Helen's warm brown eyes and expressive hands. Mom! Emma's face lit up, and she crossed the room to hug Helen tightly. I missed you. I missed you too, sweetheart. Helen held her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. How are you doing? Good. Really good. Victoria's been showing me some art galleries in the South End, and next week, we're going to see the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Emma's enthusiasm was genuine, but Helen heard the subtext. These were experiences Helen couldn't provide, worlds she couldn't open for her daughter. Tony emerged from the kitchen, flour in his dark hair and excitement on his face. At 14, he was all limbs and angles, but his smile was pure joy. Mom, the chef is making this incredible stuffing with chestnuts and truffle oil. He said I could help with the plating. Helen's heart swelled. Tony had inherited her love of cooking, though he was already surpassing her skills with techniques she'd never learned. "That sounds wonderful, honey. Maybe you could show him some of your grandmother's recipes," Richard suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "Oh yes," Margaret said with bright condescension. "I'm sure Tony would enjoy learning about traditional cooking methods. It's so important to understand one's roots, even the more humble ones." Helen felt the familiar sting. Her grandmother's recipes weren't quaint relics. They were carefully guarded family treasures, passed down through generations of women who'd created magic with simple ingredients and endless love. But in this room, surrounded by catered perfection, they became curiosities, emblems of a simpler, lesser world. Dinner was announced, and they moved to the formal dining room. The table was a masterpiece of crystal and silver, each place setting worth more than Helen's monthly rent. She found herself seated between Charles and a family friend whose name she'd forgotten, strategically placed away from Richard and the children. The meal proceeded like a performance. Course after course of sophisticated food arrived, each dish more elaborate than the last. Helen navigated the multiple forks and glasses with care, hyper-aware of every movement under Margaret's watchful gaze. The conversation flowed around topics that excluded her: mutual friends she'd never met, vacation homes in the Hamptons, charity galas where the ticket prices exceeded her monthly income. When someone did address her directly, it was with the careful courtesy reserved for outsiders. "Helen works with numbers," Victoria explained to a guest who'd asked about Helen's profession. "Bookkeeping for local businesses. It's so admirable, really, how she's found her niche." Helen's education, a hard-earned degree from Northeastern while working full-time to support herself, was reduced to working with numbers. Her expertise in helping small business owners navigate complex financial challenges became finding her niche, as if she'd stumbled into it rather than fought for it. "Tell us about your neighborhood, Helen," Charles said during a lull in conversation. "We so rarely get to hear about authentic Boston anymore. Everything's becoming so gentrified." "The North End is changing," Helen replied carefully, "but it's still home to families who've been there for generations." "How quaint that must be," Margaret added. "All those narrow streets and little cafes. Like stepping back in time, though I imagine the property values reflect that historical character." The implication was clear. Helen lived somewhere valuable only for its nostalgia, not its actual worth. Her neighbors were relics, her home a museum piece rather than a living community. Emma glanced at her mother, catching the subtle insults even if Tony remained obliviously focused on his food. Helen saw recognition dawn in her daughter's eyes, the understanding that this wasn't just conversation, but warfare conducted with polite smiles and crystal glasses. As the main course plates were cleared, Helen stood instinctively. "Let me help with—" "Oh, Helen, no." Margaret's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You don't belong at this table, dear. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the kitchen." The silence that followed was deafening. Forks paused midway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the staff seemed to freeze in the doorway. Helen felt the words hit her like a physical blow. 20 years of marriage to Richard. Years of trying to fit into this world. Decades of small slights and careful exclusions. All crystallized in that moment. Margaret hadn't raised her voice or used profanity. She'd simply stated what they all believed. Helen didn't belong. Richard's face went pale, but he said nothing. He looked at his plate, at his hands, anywhere but at Helen. The man who'd once promised to love and protect her couldn't even meet her eyes as his family delivered the final, crushing verdict on her worth. Helen found her voice, though it felt like speaking through water. "I should go, Helen." Richard started, but his protest was weak, obligatory. "No, it's fine." Helen's training in grace under pressure, learned through years of navigating Richard's world, kicked in automatically. "Thank you for dinner." It was illuminating. She moved with careful dignity toward the foyer, each step measured and controlled. Behind her, she heard the sharp intake of breath that was Emma's attempt not to cry, the scrape of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably, the resumption of conversation in deliberately normal tones. Emma caught up with her at the front door. "Mom, wait! Go back to dinner, sweetheart." Helen's voice was steady, though her hands shook as she retrieved her coat. "Spend time with your father and Tony." "This isn't right," Emma said, her young voice fierce with indignation. What she said was true. Helen turned to face her daughter, seeing her own anger reflected in Emma's dark eyes. "I don't belong here. I never have." "You belong wherever I am," Emma said fiercely. "You belong wherever Tony is. We're your family." Helen's composure cracked slightly. She cupped Emma's face in her hands, memorizing the fierce loyalty in her daughter's expression. "Yes, we are. Don't ever forget that." She walked to her car with measured steps, conscious of the windows overlooking the driveway, aware that her exit was probably being observed and judged. Only when she was safely behind the wheel did she allow herself to breathe. Helen drove through Beacon Hill's pristine streets, past the gas lamps and brick sidewalks, past the world that had always been just beyond her reach. She'd tried so hard to belong, to become the kind of woman Richard's family could accept. She'd modified her accent, learned which fork to use, studied art and literature and classical music. But none of it mattered. She would always be Helen Follies from the North End, the girl who smelled like garlic and worked with her hands. Tears finally came as she navigated toward home, blurring the elegant storefronts and expensive restaurants. She'd built her entire adult life around the idea that love could bridge any gap, that authenticity and warmth could overcome pedigree and money. Tonight had proven her spectacularly wrong. But as she turned onto Hanover Street, something shifted in her peripheral vision. Danny Sullivan's food truck sat at the corner, its cheerful lights cutting through the November darkness. Even at 8 o'clock on Thanksgiving night, a small line of people waited patiently. Construction workers heading home from emergency calls, hospital staff grabbing dinner between shifts, elderly neighbors drawn by the warmth and community. Helen slowed her car, watching through tear-blurred eyes as Danny handed steaming containers to customers with genuine smiles and easy conversation. She saw an elderly Italian man gesturing animatedly, while Danny listened with obvious interest. A young nurse paid for her meal and lingered to chat, clearly in no hurry to leave the circle of warmth and acceptance. This was belonging, Helen realized. Not the careful choreography of crystal and criticism she'd just endured, but this, honest food shared with honest people, community built around simple human needs rather than complex social hierarchies. For the first time in hours, Helen felt something other than humiliation burning in her chest. It was small, fragile as a candle flame but unmistakable. It was hope. Helen's hands trembled as she fumbled with her apartment keys, the echo of Margaret's words still ringing in her ears. The narrow stairwell of her North End building felt like sanctuary after the suffocating perfection of Beacon Hill. She climbed the 2 flights slowly, each step carrying her further from the humiliation and closer to something that felt real. Her apartment welcomed her with familiar chaos. Emma's SAT prep books scattered across the kitchen table, Tony's sketch pad open to a drawing of some fantastical creature, the lingering scent of this morning's coffee. This was home. Imperfect, cramped, but undeniably hers. Helen went straight to the kitchen, muscle memory guiding her to the cabinet where she kept her grandmother's wooden spoon. The weight of it in her hand grounded her, connecting her to generations of women who'd faced their troubles by feeding people. She pulled out ingredients without conscious thought: San Marzano tomatoes, garlic, fresh basil from the windowsill garden that caught whatever sunlight managed to filter through the neighboring buildings. The ritual of cooking began to steady her. Olive oil heated in the pan, releasing its green perfume. Garlic sizzled, filling the small kitchen with warmth. She crushed tomatoes with her hands the way Nana had taught her, feeling the seeds and juice run between her fingers. Each action was deliberate, meditative, washing away the taste of caviar and condescension. "You don't belong at this table." Helen's knife paused mid-chop. The words had been delivered so casually, with the same tone Margaret might use to comment on the weather. That was what hurt most. Not anger or passion, but simple, matter-of-fact dismissal. The front door opened, and Emma's voice carried through the apartment. "Mom? You're home early." Helen quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand before Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her daughter had changed from the navy dress into jeans and an oversized sweater, but her face still held the shock of what she'd witnessed. "I couldn't stay," Helen said simply, stirring the sauce with more force than necessary. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma crossed to the stove, inhaling deeply. Nona's ragu? It felt right. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sauce bubble and reduce. Emma had inherited Helen's intuitive understanding of cooking, knowing when to stir, when to season, when to simply let time work its magic. What she said was unforgivable, Emma said finally. Helen's spoon stilled. "Was it wrong, though?" "Mom, I've spent 20 years trying to fit into their world, Emma, learning their rules, their language, their tastes. And in the end, none of it mattered. I'm still the girl from Hanover Street who speaks too loud and gestures too much." Emma moved closer, her young face fierce with indignation. "There's nothing wrong with who you are. Nothing wrong with where we come from." Helen turned to face her daughter fully. At 17, Emma straddled both worlds with an ease Helen had never managed. She could navigate Victoria's art galleries and charity functions, but she could also argue politics with the guys at Bova Bakery and help Mrs. Antonelli with her groceries. Maybe that was the difference. Emma had never tried to erase one part of herself to fit into another. "Tell me about the Wellington Academy," Helen said quietly. Emma's face flushed. "I didn't know they were going to ambush you with that. Dad mentioned it last week, but I thought it was just talk." "And what do you think?" "I think Boston Latin is fine. More than fine. I think they want to separate me from you because they're afraid I'll turn out like you." Emma paused, then added with quiet conviction, "Which wouldn't be the worst thing in the world." Helen felt her throat tighten. "Oh, sweetheart. I'm serious. You work 3 jobs to keep us afloat. You help Mr. DeLuca with his taxes for free because you know he can't afford an accountant. You make this incredible food that brings people together. What's wrong with any of that?" Helen ladled sauce over fresh pasta, the simple action buying her time to process her daughter's words. When had Emma become so wise? When had she stopped being the child who needed protection and become the young woman offering it? They ate in companionable silence, the ragu working its familiar magic. Food as comfort, as communication, as love made tangible. This was what Helen understood. How a perfect balance of salt and acid could heal wounds. How sharing a meal could bridge any distance. "I keep thinking about that food truck," Helen said suddenly. "What food truck?" "On the way home, I saw Danny Sullivan's truck. You know, the one that's always parked near the tea station? There were people lined up, even on Thanksgiving night. All different kinds of people, all talking and laughing together." Emma nodded. She'd bought coffee from Danny's truck before school, drawn by the warmth that radiated from the small window and the way he remembered everyone's order. "It made me think," Helen continued, twirling pasta around her fork, "about belonging, about tables." "What do you mean?" Helen was quiet for a long moment, the idea still too fragile to fully articulate. What if instead of trying to earn a seat at someone else's table, you built your own?" Emma's eyes widened slightly. "You mean like a restaurant?" "I don't know, maybe. Something where everyone would be welcome. Where being authentic wasn't a liability, but a strength." Helen laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Listen to me. 48 hours ago, I was worried about which fork to use for the salad course." "Don't dismiss it," Emma said urgently. "I've seen how people react to your cooking. Remember Tony's birthday last year? You made those arancini, and Mrs. Chen from downstairs said they were better than anything she'd had in Sicily." "That's different. That's just what?" Just incredible food made with love and skill? Just creating something that brings people joy? Emma leaned forward, her enthusiasm building. Mom, you've been underestimating yourself for years. Dad's family has you convinced that what you do isn't valuable because it's not their definition of valuable. Helen stared at her daughter, seeing herself reflected in Emma's passionate defense. When had she stopped believing in her own worth? When had she accepted Margaret's assessment of her value? It would be insane, Helen said slowly. I don't know anything about running a restaurant. The permits, the regulations, the startup costs. So you learn? You research? You figure it out? Emma reached across the small table and grasped her mother's hands. You taught yourself bookkeeping by checking out library books. You learned to navigate Dad's world by watching and adapting. If you can do that, you can do anything. Helen felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of chains she hadn't realized she'd been wearing. For years, she'd defined herself in relation to others. Richard's wife, Emma and Tony's mother, the outsider at the Whitmore table. But sitting in her tiny kitchen, surrounded by the sense of her heritage and her daughter's fierce love, she began to remember who she'd been before she'd tried to become someone else. A place where everyone belongs, she murmured. Nana's table, Emma said without hesitation. Helen's breath caught. What? That's what you'd call it, Nana's table. Because she taught you everything about cooking, about feeding people with love. And because at Nona's table, there was always room for one more. Tears threatened again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed on the drive home. These carried possibility rather than pain. Helen could almost see it. Warm lights spilling from windows, the sound of laughter and conversation, the smell of garlic and basil and fresh bread drawing people in from the cold Boston streets. It's a beautiful dream, she said finally. It doesn't have to be just a dream. Helen looked at her daughter, 17 years old, and absolutely fearless in the way only the young can be. Emma believed it was possible because she'd never learned that some dreams were too big, some leaps too dangerous. Maybe that was exactly what Helen needed to hear. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the narrow streets of the North End with possibility. Helen finished her pasta and began planning, her grandmother's wooden spoon still warm in her hand. The next morning found Helen hunched over a laptop at the North End branch library, surrounded by printouts about restaurant licenses, health department regulations, and business plan templates. Her notebook, the same one she'd used for her bookkeeping clients, was now filled with calculations, sketches, and questions written in her careful handwriting. The research was overwhelming. Food service permits, liquor licenses, fire department approvals, workers' compensation insurance. Each requirement seemed designed to discourage dreamers, to separate those with deep pockets from those with mere passion. Helen's stomach churned as she calculated startup costs. Equipment, renovation, inventory, payroll for at least 6 months until the business could sustain itself. Researching your competition? Helen looked up to find Danny Sullivan standing beside her table, holding a steaming coffee cup and wearing the same warm smile she'd observed from her car 3 nights ago. Up close, he was younger than she'd thought, maybe early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and laugh lines that spoke of someone who found joy in simple things. Oh no, Helen started to close the laptop, then stopped herself. Why was she hiding? Actually, yes. Sort of. Danny gestured to the empty chair across from her. Mind if I sit? I've got 20 minutes before my lunch rush starts. Helen nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. She'd thrown on jeans and an old sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Nothing like the polished women who probably caught Danny's attention. Food truck business looking to expand? He asked, nodding toward her research. Restaurant, Helen said, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. Theoretical restaurant. Nothing theoretical about those permit applications. Trust me, I've filled out most of them. Danny's eyes were kind, without judgment. What's your concept? Helen hesitated. She'd barely articulated the idea to Emma, and here was a stranger asking her to explain a dream that felt too fragile to expose to daylight. Comfort food, she said finally. But elevated. Different cultures, but all welcoming. A place where everyone feels like they belong. Something shifted in Danny's expression. That's beautiful. And harder than it sounds. You think it's naive. I think it's necessary. Danny leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. You know why I left fine dining? Spent 10 years cooking for people who treated food like a performance. Servers like invisible furniture, and anyone who couldn't afford their prices like they didn't exist. One night I served a 12-course tasting menu to a table that sent back 3 courses because they weren't Instagram-worthy enough, and I realized I was cooking for all the wrong reasons. Helen felt something click into place. So you bought a food truck. So I bought a food truck. Best decision I ever made. Now I cook for Mrs. Delacroix, who comes by every Tuesday for her late husband's favorite sandwich. For construction crews who work 16-hour days and just want something hot and honest. For kids spending their lunch money on something that reminds them their grandmother loves them. That's exactly what I want to create, Helen said, her voice gaining strength. But bigger. A real restaurant where all those people could sit down together. Danny studied her for a moment. What's your background? Culinary school? Restaurant experience? Helen's cheeks flushed. Home cooking. My grandmother taught me. I've been doing other things for the past 20 years. Like what? Bookkeeping. Raising kids. Trying to fit into... She stopped herself. Why was she explaining her failures to this man? I don't have formal training. Neither did my grandfather, and he ran the best diner in Southie for 40 years. Neither did most of the women who created the dishes that restaurants charge $50 for now. Danny's voice carried conviction. You know what matters more than culinary school? Understanding that food is love made edible. Sounds like you've got that figured out. Helen felt tears threaten again, not from pain this time, but from the unexpected kindness of being seen and validated by someone who understood. The numbers are terrifying, she admitted, gesturing to her notebooks. Startup costs, operating expenses, the failure rate for new restaurants. All true. Also true that some restaurants succeed. Usually the ones run by people who understand why they're doing it. Danny pulled out his phone and scrolled through something. There's a space that might interest you. Owner's been trying to lease it for months. But he's picky about who he rents to. Wants someone who'll serve the community, not gentrify it out of existence. Helen's heart jumped. Where? Corner of Salem and Cross. Used to be Mama Benedetti's. You probably remember it. She closed last year when her arthritis got too bad, but the kitchen equipment is still there. Good bones, needs work, but the price is right for someone with the right vision. Helen knew the space. She'd eaten at Mama Benedetti's as a child, remembered the red checkered tablecloths, and the way Mrs. Benedetti would pinch her cheek and slip her extra meatballs when her mother wasn't looking. The thought of breathing new life into that space felt like destiny. Would you? Helen hesitated, then forced herself to continue. Would you look at it with me? I know we just met, but I could use someone who knows the business. Danny's smile was immediate and genuine. I'd be honored. When? Now? Helen surprised herself with her eagerness. If you have time after your lunch rush. Deal. But first, let me ask you something. This dream of yours, where does it come from? Really? Helen thought about Margaret's cutting words, about years of feeling like an outsider, about watching Danny's food truck create community in a few square feet of sidewalk space. I want to prove that belonging isn't something that gets granted to you, she said slowly. It's something you create. For yourself, and for others. Danny nodded as if she'd just revealed a fundamental truth. Then you're already ahead of most people who go into this business. Come on, let me introduce you to some real comfort food. They walked to Danny's truck together, Helen's notebook tucked under her arm, her mind already racing with possibilities. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, she felt like she was moving towards something rather than away from it. The lunch crowd at Danny's truck was exactly what Helen had observed from her car. Diverse, friendly, united by their appreciation for honest food served with genuine warmth. As she watched Danny work, noting how he remembered names and preferences, how he asked about kids and jobs and weekend plans, she began to understand that what she wanted to create wasn't just a restaurant. It was a revolution, one meal at a time. Helen's hands shook as she held the certified letter from Morrison, Keyes & Associates, Richard's law firm. She'd recognized the letterhead immediately. That imposing serif font that had once appeared on their wedding invitations, now delivering what felt like a declaration of war. "Mom?" Tony's voice carried from the kitchen, where he was attempting to recreate the truffle oil technique he'd learned at Thanksgiving dinner. "Everything okay?" "Fine, honey," Helen called back, though her voice cracked slightly. She tore open the envelope with more force than necessary, scanning the legal language that essentially boiled down to one devastating message. Richard and Victoria were petitioning for primary custody of both children, citing Helen's recent erratic behavior and financially irresponsible decisions as evidence of her unfitness as a parent. The restaurant. They were using her dream against her. Helen sank onto her living room couch, the same one she'd bought secondhand when she and Richard first separated. The apartment suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls closing in as she read phrases like unstable living situation and questionable judgment regarding the children's welfare. How had her desire to create something meaningful become evidence of her failure as a mother? Her phone buzzed. Brad Mitchell's name appeared on the screen, the young investor who'd overheard her discussing restaurant plans at the coffee shop 2 weeks ago. She'd been avoiding his calls, overwhelmed by the generous offer of backing he'd extended after their brief conversation. "Mrs. Follies? I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Helen almost laughed. Could there be a worse time? "Actually, Brad, I've been thinking about your concept. I'd like to meet formally. Discuss terms. I've put together some preliminary numbers that I think you'll find encouraging." Helen stared at the legal papers spread across her coffee table. 6 months ago, this call would have felt like a miracle. Now it felt like cruel timing. "I appreciate your interest, but I need to be honest. I'm dealing with some family complications that might make this impossible." "What kind of complications?" Helen hesitated. Brad was barely older than Emma, an MIT graduate whose enthusiasm for her project had been infectious when they'd first met. How could she explain that her ex-husband's family saw her entrepreneurial ambitions as evidence of maternal instability? "Custody issues," she said finally. "My ex-husband is challenging my fitness as a parent, partly because of the restaurant plans." The silence stretched long enough that Helen wondered if the call had dropped. "That's ridiculous," Brad said finally, his young voice carrying surprising anger. "Starting a business shows initiative, planning, commitment to providing for your family. Any judge would see that. Would they?" Helen's voice was smaller than she intended. Or would they see a divorced woman making risky decisions with money she doesn't have? They'd see someone brave enough to bet on herself. "Look, Mrs. Follies, I've been in tech long enough to know that most successful entrepreneurs get called crazy before they get called visionary. The question is, do you believe in what you're trying to build?" Helen closed her eyes, thinking of the Mama Benedetti's space she'd visited with Danny the previous week. The kitchen had good bones, the dining room held echoes of decades of laughter and conversation, and Mrs. Benedetti herself had squeezed Helen's hands and said the space was waiting for someone who understood what it meant to feed people's souls. "Yes," Helen said quietly, "I do. Then let's fight for it. I'll connect you with a family lawyer who specializes in cases like this, someone who understands that pursuing your dreams doesn't make you a bad parent. It makes you a role model." After Brad hung up, Helen sat holding the phone, feeling the first stirrings of something she hadn't experienced in days, hope mixed with determination. She was tired of being judged, tired of apologizing for wanting more than what others deemed appropriate for someone like her. Emma burst through the front door, her cheeks flushed from the December cold. "Mom, you'll never guess what happened at school." She stopped short, taking in Helen's expression and the legal documents scattered on the table. "What's wrong?" Helen handed her the letter without a word. She watched her daughter's face change as she read, anger replacing confusion, then crystallizing into something harder and more determined. "They can't do this," Emma said flatly. "They can try." "No, I mean they literally can't do this. I'm 18 in 3 months. I can choose where I live, and I choose here. With you. Emma's voice carried the same fierce protectiveness Helen remembered from the Thanksgiving dinner. And Tony would never choose to live with Victoria full-time, never. As if summoned by his name, Tony appeared in the doorway, a wooden spoon covered in what looked like truffle oil in his hand. At 14, he still had the lanky awkwardness of adolescence, but his dark eyes held an intelligence that sometimes startled Helen with its depth. "What's going on?" he asked, noting the tension in the room. Emma started to speak, but Helen held up a hand. Tony deserved to hear this from her, not filtered through his sister's anger. "Your father and Victoria are asking the court to let you live with them full-time," Helen said gently. "They think I'm not making good decisions." Tony's face went very still. "Because of the restaurant?" "Partly." "That's stupid." Tony's voice was quiet but certain. "The restaurant is the best idea you've had in years. It's the first time I've seen you excited about something since you and Dad split up." Helen felt her throat tighten. When had her 14-year-old son become so wise? "I want to testify," Emma said suddenly. "In court. If this goes to trial, I want to tell them exactly what kind of mother you are." "Emma?" "No, I'm serious. Let them hear about how you worked 3 jobs to keep us in our schools after Dad left. Let them hear about how you help half the neighborhood with their taxes for free. Let them hear about how you've never missed a single school event, how you taught me to be proud of where I come from instead of ashamed of it." Tony nodded vigorously. "And how you're teaching me to cook real food, not just fancy stuff that looks good on Instagram. And how you listen when I tell you about the weird kids at school who don't fit in anywhere." Helen looked at her children, these remarkable young people she'd somehow managed to raise despite every mistake and uncertainty, and felt something shift inside her chest. The fear was still there, but it was no longer the dominant emotion. "Okay," she said slowly. "Then we fight. All of us. Together." Emma's smile was fierce. "And we open the restaurant anyway?" Helen thought about Margaret's dismissive voice, about Victoria's subtle cruelties, about years of accepting that she didn't deserve a seat at certain tables. Then she thought about Mrs. Benedetti's blessing, about Danny's faith in her vision, about Brad's belief that dreams were worth fighting for. "We open the restaurant," she said firmly. "Because the best way to prove you belong somewhere is to create that place yourself." Outside, Boston's early winter darkness had settled over the North End, but inside Helen's small apartment, something bright and determined was taking root. The battle lines had been drawn, but for the first time in years, Helen felt ready for the fight. Helen's signature felt heavier than it should have as she signed the lease agreement for the former Mama Benedetti's space. The pen trembled slightly in her hand, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she was committing to. 6 months of rent paid up front from her divorce settlement. Everything she had, bet on everything she believed. "You sure about this?" Danny asked, standing beside her in the empty restaurant space. Dust motes danced in the December sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. "No," Helen admitted, then smiled. "But I'm doing it anyway." The space looked different in daylight. Smaller, shabbier, more daunting. The red checkered tablecloths were gone, revealing scarred wooden surfaces. The kitchen equipment was older than she'd remembered, though Danny had assured her it was still functional. Everything would need deep cleaning, fresh paint, new life breathed into tired bones. Emma pushed through the front door carrying a toolbox borrowed from their neighbor. "The cavalry has arrived," she announced, her voice echoing in the empty dining room. Behind her came Tony, Mrs. Chen from downstairs, and, surprisingly, 3 of Emma's classmates who'd heard about the project and volunteered their Saturday. "This is really happening," Helen whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Damn right it is," said a gravelly voice from the doorway. Betty O'Malley stood silhouetted against the morning light, her silver hair caught back in a practical bun, wearing work clothes that had seen decades of use. At 70, the retired teacher moved with the authority of someone who'd spent her life getting things done. Mrs. O'Malley, Helen started, surprised to see the neighborhood fixture. I didn't know you were coming to help? Course I am. Heard through the grapevine that some young upstart was planning to bring this place back to life. Betty's sharp blue eyes surveyed the space critically. About time. This corner's been dead too long. Danny stepped forward. Helen, meet your first customer and biggest critic. Betty here ran the neighborhood watch for 30 years and has opinions about everything, especially about people who don't understand what they're getting into, Betty said pointedly, fixing Helen with a stare that could have stripped paint. Running a restaurant isn't playing house girl. It's 18-hour days, razor-thin margins, and customers who'll complain if you sneeze wrong. Helen felt the familiar flutter of inadequacy. I know it won't be easy. Easy? Betty's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Nothing about this will be easy. Question is, you got the spine for it? The challenge hung in the air. Helen looked around at the people who'd shown up to help. Danny with his quiet confidence, Emma radiating fierce loyalty, Tony already examining the kitchen equipment with professional curiosity, the neighborhood volunteers who'd given up their Saturday for a stranger's dream. Ask me again in 6 months, Helen said finally. Betty's stern expression cracked into something that might have been approval. That's the right answer. Now, let's get to work. This place won't fix itself. The next hours blurred together in a symphony of scraping, cleaning, and planning. Helen found herself wielding a paint scraper with unexpected competence, stripping decades of accumulated grime from surfaces that slowly revealed their original beauty. Emma's friends proved surprisingly useful, bringing young energy and social media savvy to document the transformation. But it was the discovery of structural problems that tested Helen's resolve. Behind the kitchen's back wall, Danny found water damage that would require extensive repair. The electrical system needed updating to meet current codes. Each issue meant more money, more time, more risk. We can do this in phases, Danny suggested as they stood surveying the damaged wall. Get the basics working first. Tackle the big repairs as revenue comes in. Helen pulled out her notebook, calculating and recalculating numbers that never seemed to add up right. Even with Brad's investment, the unexpected costs were threatening to devour her entire budget before they'd served a single meal. Mom! Tony appeared at her elbow, his face smudged with dust but his eyes bright with excitement. You need to see this. He led her to the kitchen, where he'd been cleaning the old stove. Taped inside one of the cabinets was an envelope marked, "For the next dreamer," in Mrs. Benedetti's careful handwriting. Inside was a check for $5,000 and a note. Every good cook needs help with the first batch. Make beautiful things. Feed people's souls. Lucia Helen sank onto a paint-splattered stool, the check blurring through sudden tears. Around her, the sound of scraping and hammering continued, the rhythm of dreams being built one scrape, one nail, one act of faith at a time. This neighborhood's been through 3 waves of change since I moved here in 1953, Betty O'Malley said, perched on a crate in what would become Nana's table's dining room. 2 weeks into renovations, she'd appointed herself unofficial project supervisor and neighborhood historian. First wave was urban renewal. They called it slum clearance back then. Tore down half the old tenements, scattered families to the wind. Helen paused in her menu planning, drawn by the authority in Betty's voice. Around them, the transformation continued. Emma painting trim with careful precision, Tony experimenting with recipes on the newly cleaned stove, Danny rewiring outlets with the patience of someone who'd done this before. Second wave came in the 80s, Betty continued, her sharp eyes watching Helen's reaction. Young professionals discovered we had, quote, character. Rents doubled overnight. Mrs. Torino lived here 60 years, got priced out by lawyers who thought exposed brick was charming. Helen felt a familiar unease creeping up her spine. Are you saying I'm contributing to? I'm saying every change brings choices, Betty interrupted. Question is, you here to serve this community or replace it? The bluntness of it hit Helen like cold water. She'd been so focused on creating a place where she belonged that she hadn't fully considered what belonging meant for people who were already here. Tell me about the neighborhood, Helen said, setting down her menu notes. Really tell me. Betty's weathered face softened slightly. Come here Tuesday morning. Meet the people you want to serve. Quote. That Tuesday, Helen found herself walking Salem Street with Betty at 7 a.m., the neighborhood coming alive around them. They stopped at Polcari's Coffee, where Betty introduced her to Francesco, who'd been roasting beans since 1932. At the corner market, she met the Nguyen family, who'd transformed their small space into a lifeline for elderly residents who couldn't travel far for groceries. Each introduction came with stories: who needed help with rent, whose grandson was struggling in school, which families had been here for generations, and which were newer arrivals finding their place. Mrs. Delacroix, the one Danny mentioned, Betty said, pointing to an elderly black woman carefully navigating the uneven sidewalk, moved here in '65 when her husband got work at the Navy Yard, raised 4 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment, sent 3 to college. Now she's on a fixed income, and her arthritis makes cooking difficult. Helen watched Mrs. Delacroix stop at Danny's food truck, saw the genuine warmth in their interaction, the way Danny's face lit up when she approached. What would she order at my restaurant? Helen asked. Nothing, Betty said bluntly. Can't afford it. But her great-granddaughter might, if you make it welcoming to all of them, not just the ones with college degrees and downtown jobs. The conversation shifted something fundamental in Helen's planning. That afternoon, she revised her menu concept entirely. Instead of elevated comfort food targeting upscale diners, she designed a menu that honored the neighborhood's diversity. Mrs. Benedetti's ragu alongside Mrs. Delacroix's favorite cornbread recipe, Vietnamese pho next to Irish shepherd's pie. Prices that working families could afford, portions that satisfied construction workers and office employees alike. Danny found her that evening, surrounded by discarded menu drafts and recipe cards. Betty giving you the neighborhood education? She's terrifying, Helen admitted. And absolutely right. I was planning a restaurant for people like me to feel better about themselves, not a place for people like Mrs. Delacroix to feel welcome. That's the difference between gentrification and community building, Danny said, settling beside her on the floor where she'd spread out her work. Gentrification replaces what's here with something better. Community building improves what's here while keeping its heart. Helen leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. Over the past month, their partnership had deepened beyond business. He'd become her sounding board, her reality check, her steady presence during moments of doubt. But the specter of her failed marriage made trust difficult. What if I screw this up? She asked quietly. What if I get the custody hearing wrong, or the restaurant fails, or I prove Richard's family right about everything? Danny's arm tightened around her. Then you'll figure out what comes next. That's what people who build things do. They adapt, they learn, they keep building. Even when they're scared? Especially when they're scared. The custody hearing was now 3 weeks away. Helen's lawyer, recommended by Brad and specializing in cases where entrepreneurial mothers face traditional family court biases, had been preparing her for the questions Victoria's legal team would ask. They would challenge her financial stability, her time management, her priorities. They would frame her restaurant dreams as evidence of selfishness rather than ambition. But Helen was learning to frame her own narrative differently. With Betty's guidance, she'd developed a business plan that served the community rather than displaced it. With Danny's support, she'd found her voice as someone who created rather than consumed. With her children's fierce loyalty, she'd remembered that family was built on love and respect, not just financial security. The menu was finally taking shape. Dishes that told stories, honored traditions, created bridges between cultures. She'd planned a Tuesday special for seniors on fixed incomes, a family dinner deal for working parents, a breakfast program for the elementary school nearby. Nana's table wouldn't just serve food. It would serve as a gathering place for a community that was constantly being told it didn't matter. Emma appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with excitement. Mom, you need to see this. She held up her phone, showing Helen a social media post she'd created about the restaurant's progress. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors offering help, sharing memories of Mama Benedetti's, expressing hope for what the space could become again. Look at the comments, Emma urged. Mrs. Chen wants to teach you her dumpling recipe. The Garcias offered to help with weekend service. 3 different people asked about job openings. Helen scrolled through the responses, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the space heaters keeping the restaurant livable during renovation. This wasn't just her dream anymore. It was becoming the neighborhood's dream, carried forward by the same community spirit that had sustained these streets through decades of change. Betty appeared in the doorway, her expression as stern as ever. Dinner service test run tomorrow night. Invited 20 neighbors. Hope you're ready to cook for people who'll tell you the truth about your food. Helen's stomach fluttered with nerves and anticipation. Ready as I'll ever be. Good, because if you pass this test, you'll have something more valuable than good reviews or fancy press. You'll have the neighborhood's blessing. And once you have that, Betty's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. No judge in Boston will question your judgment about what's best for your family. Outside, snow began falling again, blanketing the north end in pristine white. But inside Nona's table, warmed by friendship and sustained by purpose, Helen felt ready for whatever test came next. The Suffolk County Family Court felt like a temple designed to intimidate. Marble floors that echoed every footstep, mahogany benches that dwarfed anyone who dared to sit in them, and windows so high they seemed to judge from heaven itself. Helen smoothed her navy blazer, the same one she'd worn to job interviews after the divorce, and tried to calm her racing heart. Across the aisle, Victoria sat beside Richard, her posture perfect in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Helen's monthly rent. Her expression was serene, confident, like someone attending a church service rather than a battle for children's lives. Richard wouldn't meet Helen's eyes, his discomfort obvious in the way he fidgeted with his wedding ring. The new one, gold and substantial, nothing like the simple band Helen had once placed on his finger. Remember, Helen's lawyer Sarah Chen whispered, they're going to try to paint you as unstable. Every answer should demonstrate your commitment to the children's best interests. Judge Patricia Moreau entered with the authority of someone who'd heard every custody argument imaginable. In her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, she reviewed the case file with the efficiency of someone who understood that every minute spent in legal maneuvering was time stolen from families trying to heal. Victoria's lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Cromwell, who specialized in high-stakes family cases, rose with theatrical precision. Your Honor, we're here today because my client fears for the welfare of two children whose mother has chosen to prioritize a risky business venture over their stability. Helen's hands clenched in her lap. Risky business venture. As if creating something meaningful was inherently irresponsible. Mrs. Whitmore, Cromwell continued, addressing Victoria, please describe your concerns about the current custody arrangement. Victoria's voice was measured, reasonable, devastating. Helen has invested her entire divorce settlement into a restaurant in a neighborhood experiencing significant crime issues. She's working 18-hour days on construction and menu planning, leaving the children to fend for themselves. Emma has missed several Wellington Academy preparatory sessions because Helen can't provide reliable transportation. Tony's grades have dropped because there's no stable homework supervision. Each word was carefully chosen, each accusation technically true but stripped of context. Yes, Helen was working long hours, building something that would provide long-term security for her family. Yes, Emma had missed some prep sessions because she'd chosen to help her mother rather than be groomed for a world that looked down on people like them. Yes, Tony's grades had dipped because he was processing his parents' conflict, not because Helen was neglecting him. Mrs. Whitmore, Cromwell continued, what would you provide that the children aren't currently receiving? Stability, structure, educational opportunities that match their potential. Emma could attend Wellington Academy, one of the finest private schools in Massachusetts. Tony could receive tutoring to address his academic challenges. They would live in a safe neighborhood with access to cultural enrichment, music lessons, art classes, social connections that will serve them throughout their lives. Helen felt the familiar sting of class warfare disguised as concern. Victoria was offering Helen's children everything Helen couldn't afford, packaging it as love, while systematically dismantling Helen's worth as a parent. When Sarah Chen rose to cross-examine, her questions were sharp and purposeful. Mrs. Whitmore, how many hours per week do you currently spend with Emma and Tony? Victoria's composure flickered slightly. Well, I work full-time at the gallery, and there are evening commitments. Approximately how many hours? Perhaps 15 to 20 hours of quality time weekly. And how many hours does Mrs. Follies spend with her children? I wouldn't know exact numbers. According to the school records, Mrs. Follies has attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every athletic event that Emma and Tony have participated in over the past 3 years. Were you aware of that? Victoria's perfect composure began to crack. Attending events isn't the same as providing opportunities. You mentioned Wellington Academy. Are you aware that Emma has explicitly stated she doesn't want to attend private school? Children don't always know what's best for them. And who decides what's best? You? The objection came swiftly, but the damage was visible in Victoria's flushed cheeks and Richard's obvious discomfort. When Helen took the stand, her voice was steady, despite her thundering heart. Sarah guided her through her business plan, her community involvement, her vision for Nona's table as both financial security and legacy for her children. Mrs. Follies, why did you choose to invest in this restaurant? Helen looked directly at Judge Moreau. Because I want my children to see that belonging isn't something you beg for. It's something you create. I want them to understand that our heritage, our community, our values aren't obstacles to overcome, but strengths to build upon. Some might argue that using your entire settlement was financially irresponsible. Some might argue that accepting charity from people who fundamentally don't respect you is more damaging to children than taking a calculated risk on your own abilities. The courtroom fell silent. Helen had just articulated what everyone understood but no one had said. This wasn't about money or opportunity. It was about dignity. When Emma took the stand, her voice carried the same fierce clarity Helen remembered from Thanksgiving night. Your Honor, my mother works harder than anyone I know. She's building something that will serve our community, employ our neighbors, and teach me and my brother that success means more than just making money. It means making a difference. What would you say to concerns about your mother's ability to provide stability? Emma's smile was sharp as broken glass. I'd say that the most unstable thing in my life was watching my father choose his new family's comfort over defending his children's mother from deliberate cruelty. Richard's face went ashen. Across the courtroom, Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. Tony's testimony was brief but devastating in its simplicity. My mom teaches me to cook because she says food is love you can taste. Victoria buys expensive ingredients and hires someone else to cook them. I know which one feels more like home. When Judge Moreau delivered her verdict, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many families destroyed by pride and prejudice. This court finds no evidence that Mrs. Follies poses any risk to her children's welfare. Indeed, the evidence suggests that her entrepreneurial endeavors demonstrate exactly the kind of initiative and community investment we should encourage in parents. The current custody arrangement will remain unchanged. Helen's legs nearly gave out with relief. Emma's arms were around her immediately, Tony joining them in a fierce hug that spoke louder than any legal declaration. As they left the courthouse, Richard approached hesitantly. Helen, what Victoria's family said at Thanksgiving, what we tried to do here, I was wrong. About all of it. Helen studied the man she'd once loved, seeing in his face the boy who'd been brave enough to fall in love with a girl from the North End, but not strong enough to defend that choice when it mattered. I know you were, she said simply, but thank you for saying it. The restaurant, Richard continued. If there's anything I can do to support what you're building. Helen's smile was genuine, if sad. The best thing you can do is be the father Emma and Tony deserve. Everything else, I've got handled. Outside, snow was falling again, but Helen felt only warmth as she walked toward Nana's table with her children, ready to serve their first official dinner to the neighborhood that had already claimed them as family. 3 days before opening, Helen stood in the middle of Nana's table at 4 a.m, surrounded by the chaos of a dream coming to life. Boxes of wine glasses sat stacked beside industrial mixers that hadn't been properly calibrated. The new point-of-sale system blinked error messages in 3 different languages. Somewhere in the kitchen, a refrigerator was making an ominous grinding sound that Danny had promised to fix first thing tomorrow for the past week. Helen's hands shook as she checked items off her opening preparation list. 37 tasks remained, each one feeling more impossible than the last. The fire department inspector was coming Thursday. The final health department approval was pending. 2 of her newly hired servers had called in sick, and she was beginning to suspect they'd simply gotten better job offers elsewhere. "Mom?" Emma's voice carried through the empty dining room. "You're muttering to yourself again." Helen looked up to find her daughter standing in the doorway, hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing the black polo shirt they'd chosen as the server uniform. Even at 18, Emma moved with the confidence of someone who'd learned early that the world required you to prove your worth daily. "The mixer isn't working," Helen said, gesturing helplessly at the industrial equipment. "And Mrs. Chen's dumpling sauce separated when I tried to make a test batch. And I just realized we never ordered backup napkins, and what if we run out of napkins on opening night?" Emma crossed to her mother, placing steady hands on Helen's shoulders. "Breathe. Danny will fix the mixer. Mrs. Chen is coming in this afternoon to teach you the sauce technique again. And CVS sells napkins." "This was a mistake," Helen whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I don't know what I'm doing." Victoria was right. "I'm going to fail spectacularly, and everyone will see it." The self-doubt that had been building for weeks finally broke through Helen's determined facade. She'd been so focused on proving she belonged somewhere that she'd forgotten the terrifying possibility that maybe she didn't belong anywhere, that maybe Margaret Whitmore had been right all along. Emma's grip tightened. "Stop. Right now. You know what Victoria can't do? She can't make Mrs. Delacroix smile the way she does when she tastes your cornbread. She can't bring 3 different cultures together around one table and make them all feel welcomed. She can't take a broken-down space and turn it into something that makes people believe in community again. But what if nothing? You've already succeeded, Mom. Look around you." Helen followed her daughter's gaze. The dining room was small but warm, with mismatched chairs that Betty had insisted were more welcoming than a matched set. The walls displayed photographs from the neighborhood's history, alongside artwork from local artists. The open kitchen design meant that cooking became performance, connection, conversation. Danny appeared through the back door, carrying coffee from his truck and wearing the concerned expression he'd worn increasingly often as opening night approached. "How's our perfectionist doing this morning?" "Panicking," Emma answered before Helen could lie. "Good," Danny said, settling beside Helen on one of the dining room chairs. "If you weren't panicking, I'd be worried. Panic means you care. Panic means this matters. Panic means I'm going to mess this up in front of everyone who believed in me," Helen said miserably. Danny was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee while Emma began straightening already straight chairs with the nervous energy that ran in their family. "You want to know what I was doing 3 days before I opened my food truck?" Danny asked finally. "Sitting in my apartment at 3 a.m., convinced I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I'd left a good job, spent my savings, and for what? To sell sandwiches out of a window?" Quote. Helen looked at him, seeing the vulnerability he rarely showed. "First day, I sold $12 worth of food. $12. I went home and called my ex-wife to ask if I could have my old job back." Danny's smile was rueful. "She hung up on me. Best thing that ever happened, because it meant I had to figure out how to make it work." "And did you figure it out?" "Eventually. But not because I suddenly became confident or stopped making mistakes. I figured it out because I remembered why I was doing it. To feed people real food made with real care. Everything else was just logistics." Helen felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're not opening a restaurant to prove anything to Victoria or Margaret or anyone else. You're opening it because you understand something they never will. That feeding people is sacred work. That creating a place where everyone belongs matters more than profit margins or Yelp reviews." Tony emerged from the kitchen, his apron dusted with flour, carrying a plate of something that smelled like heaven. "Mom, try this. I think I figured out the dumpling sauce." Helen tasted the delicate, complex mixture, soy and vinegar balanced with just a hint of sweetness, exactly like Mrs. Chen's original. "Tony, this is perfect. How did you—" "I watched Mrs. Chen yesterday and wrote down everything she did. But she kept saying a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So I made 6 different batches until I found the right balance." Tony's grin was proud but nervous. "Think people will like it?" Helen looked at her son. 14 years old and already understanding that excellence came through persistence, not perfection. When had he become so wise? Betty O'Malley's voice boomed through the restaurant. "What's all this doom and gloom I'm hearing about?" The elderly woman stood in the doorway like a force of nature, carrying a large covered pot and wearing an expression that brooked no nonsense. "Betty," Helen started, "I was just having a crisis of confidence 3 days before opening. Good. Shows you have sense. Now quit your wallowing and help me set up for the final menu tasting." "Menu tasting?" "Invited 15 neighbors to try everything and tell you what's what. Can't open a restaurant without knowing if the food's actually worth eating." Betty's tone was matter-of-fact, but Helen caught the underlying affection. "Francesco's bringing his whole family. The Nguyen's are coming after they close the market. Even got Mrs. Torino to drive in from Revere. She still remembers what Mama Benedetti's sauce tasted like." Helen felt a flutter of panic mixed with excitement. These weren't anonymous restaurant critics or food bloggers. These were the people who would make or break Nona's table with their word-of-mouth recommendations. "What if they hate it?" Helen asked. "Then you'll learn something. What if they love it? Then maybe I'll stop feeling like I'm about to throw up." Betty's laugh was sharp but warm. "Child, if you stop feeling nervous, you stop caring. Nervous keeps you sharp. Nervous makes you pay attention to details. Nervous means you respect the people you're feeding." As the afternoon progressed, Helen found herself caught up in the rhythm of preparation. Danny fixed the mixer with the patient expertise of someone who'd learned to solve problems through trial and error. Emma trained the remaining servers with the natural leadership she'd inherited from both parents. Tony worked beside Helen in the kitchen, his intuitive understanding of flavors helping her fine-tune dishes that suddenly tasted exactly right. When the first neighbors arrived for the tasting, Helen felt her heart rate spike again. But as she watched Mrs. Delacroix's face light up when she tasted the cornbread, as she saw Francesco nod approvingly over the ragu, as she heard the Nguyen children exclaim over Tony's dumplings, Helen began to understand what Danny had meant about remembering why she was doing this. This wasn't about proving her worth to people who'd already decided she had none. This was about creating something beautiful, something nourishing, something that brought people together around the simple, profound act of sharing a meal. As the evening wound down and the last neighbors headed home with full bellies and promises to return opening night, Helen stood in her restaurant, truly her restaurant now, and felt ready. Not confident, not free from doubt, but ready to serve her community with the same love and care her grandmother had taught her all those years ago. The nervousness was still there, but it no longer felt like weakness. It felt like respect for the magnitude of what she was about to attempt, and the honor of being trusted to feed people's bodies and souls. Opening night arrived with the kind of February cold that made Boston feel like an Arctic outpost, but inside Nona's table, warmth radiated from every corner. Helen stood in the kitchen at 5 o'clock, watching the last of the prep work come together with the choreographed precision of a team that had learned to trust each other completely. Tony worked the pasta station with focused intensity, his movements economical and confident as he tossed fresh linguine with the sauce that had taken him 6 attempts to perfect. Emma moved between the dining room and kitchen, her natural grace making the server's role look effortless as she reviewed table assignments with their small but dedicated staff. Danny manned the grill, his quiet competence, a steady anchor in the controlled chaos of service preparation. At 6 o'clock, Helen unlocked the front door to find a line stretching halfway down Salem Street. Her heart lurched with a mixture of terror and joy as she saw familiar faces. Mrs. Delacroix bundled in her winter coat, Francesco, with his entire extended family, the Nguyen children bouncing with excitement despite the cold. But there were strangers too, drawn by word of mouth and Emma's social media campaign. People who'd heard about the neighborhood restaurant where everyone belonged. "Madonna Mia," Betty O'Malley muttered, appearing at Helen's elbow with her usual impeccable timing. "Look at this crowd. Hope you ordered enough food." "Did I?" Helen asked, genuine panic creeping into her voice. Only one way to find out. Open the doors, girl. Time to see what you're made of. The first hour was a blur of controlled disasters and small miracles. The espresso machine chose that exact moment to develop a mysterious leak, sending Danny scrambling with towels while Helen mentally recalculated beverage service. 2 orders got mixed up when a new server confused table numbers, but the customers, Mrs. Chen and her book club, simply laughed and declared they'd discovered dishes they never would have ordered otherwise. Helen found her rhythm gradually, muscle memory taking over as she tossed pasta, plated dishes, and called out orders with increasing confidence. This was what she'd trained for without knowing it. Decades of feeding her family, of understanding how flavors worked together, of reading people's faces to know what they needed. "Behind you, chef," Tony called, sliding past with a tray of his dumplings that had become the surprise hit of the evening. Helen watched him navigate the narrow kitchen with the natural grace of someone born to this work and felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with her own accomplishments. By 7:30, every table was full, and the waiting list stretched to 40 minutes. Helen should have been overwhelmed, but instead, she felt energized by the hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, the sight of people from a dozen different backgrounds sharing tables and stories over her food. "Mom!" Emma appeared beside her, slightly breathless but glowing with excitement. "Table 12 wants to send their compliments to the chef. They said the ragu reminds them of their grandmother in Naples." "Which table 12? "The elderly couple by the window. They've been here 2 hours and ordered 3 desserts." Helen glanced over to see an Italian couple in their 70s, the woman gesturing animatedly while the man nodded and smiled. They could have been her own grandparents, and the sight of their obvious pleasure sent warmth flooding through her chest. The evening's rhythm was interrupted by a commotion near the front door. Helen looked up from the stove to see Richard standing in the entrance, snow melting on his shoulders, looking simultaneously out of place and determined. He was alone, no Victoria, no entourage, just her ex-husband holding what appeared to be a small wrapped gift. The dining room fell slightly quieter as neighbors recognized him, conversations pausing as people processed the appearance of the man who'd tried to take Helen's children away just weeks earlier. Emma moved to intercept him, her protective instincts clearly engaged, but Helen caught her daughter's eye and shook her head. Whatever Richard had to say, she was ready to hear it. She found him standing awkwardly near the host's station, taking in the transformed space with obvious surprise. The elegant decay he'd probably expected had been replaced by warmth and life. Mismatched chairs that invited lingering, photographs that told the neighborhood's story, the sound of genuine laughter echoing off walls that had heard decades of such sounds. "Richard," Helen said simply. "Helen, it's beautiful. Really beautiful." His voice carried genuine admiration, free of the careful politeness she'd grown to expect. "I wanted to bring you this." He held out the wrapped package. "It's not much, but I thought, for opening night." Helen unwrapped it to find a small framed photograph, one she'd forgotten existed. It showed her and Richard in the early days of their marriage, standing in the kitchen of their first apartment, while she taught him to make her grandmother's sauce. They were both laughing, flower in their hair, looking young and hopeful and completely in love with their different worlds colliding. "I found it when I was packing some old things," Richard said quietly. "I wanted you to know that I remember the good parts, before I forgot who I was, or who we were together." Helen studied the photograph, seeing not just the memory, but the apology it represented. "Thank you. I also wanted to apologize, publicly, if you'll let me." Richard's voice was stronger now, carrying the conviction she remembered from their early years together. "What my family said to you at Thanksgiving, what Victoria and I tried to do in court, it was wrong. You're an extraordinary mother, and this," he gestured around the bustling restaurant, "this proves that you're also an extraordinary woman. I should have defended you. I should have defended us." The dining room had gone completely quiet now. Every conversation paused as neighbors processed this unexpected drama. Helen felt the weight of their attention, but also their support. These people who'd watched her transform heartbreak into hope, who'd chosen to believe in her vision when she'd barely believed in it herself. Apology accepted, Helen said simply. "But the best thing you can do now is be the father Emma and Tony deserve. They love you, Richard. Don't make them choose between loving you and respecting me." Richard nodded, his eyes bright with what might have been tears. "I won't, I promise." He looked around the restaurant once more, taking in the diverse crowd, the obvious success, the tangible proof that Helen had created exactly what she'd promised. "I'm proud of you. I know I don't have the right to say that anymore, but I needed you to know." As Richard left, the restaurant gradually returned to its celebratory buzz. But something had shifted. Helen felt a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying finally lift from her shoulders. The past was finally, truly past. Danny appeared beside her, his chef's coat splattered but his smile warm. "How are you feeling, chef?" Helen looked around her restaurant, truly hers now, in every sense that mattered. She saw Mrs. Delacroix sharing a table with a young family she'd never met, bonding over stories and shared laughter. She saw Francesco teaching the young children basic Italian while they showed him how to use chopsticks. She saw Betty holding court at the corner table, regaling anyone who'd listen with stories of the neighborhood's golden age while simultaneously planning its future. "Like I belong," Helen said finally. "Not because someone granted me permission, but because I created a place where belonging is possible." The rest of the evening flew by in a haze of satisfied customers, cleared plates, and the kind of exhausted satisfaction that comes from work that feeds the soul as much as the body. As the last customer left and her small staff finished cleaning, Helen stood in her empty restaurant and felt complete in a way she'd never experienced before. She'd built more than a business, she'd built a community, and for the first time in her life she knew exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Helen stood in the same spot where she'd once felt so lost, but everything had changed. The November air carried the scent of garlic and basil from Nona's table's kitchen, where Tony was preparing for the evening service with the confidence of someone who'd found his calling. At 15, he moved through the kitchen with an intuitive understanding of rhythm and timing that reminded Helen of her grandmother, though his techniques were more refined, influenced by Danny's formal training and his own natural innovation. "The bread's ready for the ovens," Tony called out, wiping flour from his hands with the practiced efficiency of a professional. He'd convinced Helen to add fresh-baked focaccia to the menu, arguing that the smell alone would draw people in from the street. He'd been right. The late afternoon aroma had become as much a neighborhood fixture as the church bells at St. Leonard's. Emma burst through the front door, her cheeks flushed from the November cold and her arms full of grocery bags from her weekend trip home from Northeastern. She'd chosen to stay local for college, partly for the scholarship opportunity, but mostly because she couldn't bear to leave during Nana's table's crucial first year. She worked service on weekends, her natural warmth and bilingual skills making her invaluable with the restaurant's increasingly diverse clientele. "The farmer's market had those late-season tomatoes you wanted," Emma announced, unpacking her treasures with the reverence of someone who understood that good ingredients were the foundation of everything they'd built. "Mrs. Patterson sends her love, and says to tell you the food pantry program is feeding 30 families now." Helen smiled at the mention of the program she'd started in late spring, a collaboration with the local church that provided free meals to neighbors facing food insecurity. It had been Tony's idea, inspired by watching Mrs. Delacroix carefully count her change when ordering the early bird special. Now every Tuesday evening, Nana's table served a free community dinner, funded by a sliding scale system that allowed paying customers to contribute to their neighbors' meals. "Any word from the Globe reviewer?" Danny asked, emerging from the kitchen with the perpetually amused expression he wore whenever Helen worried about external validation. The Boston Globe's food critic had visited twice in the past month, both times ordering different items and taking careful notes. The review could change everything, bring crowds they weren't equipped to handle, or elevate them to a level of recognition that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "Does it matter?" Helen asked, surprising herself with the question. 6 months ago, she would have obsessed over every word, every star, every potential criticism. Now, watching Mrs. Chen teach dumpling techniques to a young mother at table 6, while Francesco argued good-naturedly with the Nunez teenagers about the proper way to prepare marinara sauce, Helen realized she'd found something more valuable than critical acclaim. She'd found her place in the world. The evening service began with its familiar rhythm. Helen moved between kitchen and dining room, no longer the anxious perfectionist of opening night, but someone who understood that hospitality was about connection, not performance. She paused at table 4, where Betty O'Malley was holding court with her usual combination of gossip, wisdom, and fierce neighborhood loyalty. "Helen, dear," Betty called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd appointed herself unofficial restaurant hostess. "Come settle an argument. Mrs. Torres here thinks your ragu is better than her grandmother's, and I told her that's impossible because her grandmother was legendary. But then I tasted yours again tonight." Helen laughed, settling into the conversation with the ease of someone who'd learned that the best part of running a restaurant wasn't the cooking, it was the community that formed around the tables. She listened to Mrs. Torres describe her grandmother's technique, mentally noting variations she might try, always learning, always growing. The evening's turning point came when Richard appeared in the doorway, not alone this time but with Emma and Tony for their monthly dinner together. The custody arrangement had evolved naturally into something warmer than the court-mandated schedule, family dinners where Richard could see his children in the environment Helen had created, where he could witness firsthand the success he'd once doubted. "Evening, Helen," Richard said, his greeting carrying the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd learned to appreciate what he'd once dismissed. He'd been coming regularly since opening night, sometimes with business colleagues who were curious about the neighborhood restaurant everyone was talking about, sometimes alone when he seemed to need the comfort of authentic food and genuine conversation. "Your usual table's ready," Emma said, guiding her father to the corner booth they'd informally reserved for family meals. Helen watched her daughter navigate the complex dynamics with grace beyond her years, seeing how Emma had learned to love both parents without choosing sides, to honor both worlds without denying either. As the evening wound down, Helen began preparing for the next day's special event, a Thanksgiving dinner open to anyone who needed a place to belong. It had been Betty's idea, born from conversations about neighbors who'd lost family members, immigrants spending their first holiday in America, anyone who might otherwise face the day alone. 43 reservations so far, Danny reported, reviewing the list with the satisfaction of someone who understood that full tables meant more than financial success. They meant lives touched, connections made, communities strengthened. Helen looked at the reservation list, seeing names that told the story of their neighborhood's diversity. The Delacroix family, 3 generations strong. A group of graduate students from Boston University who discovered Nana's table through social media and kept returning for the sense of belonging they couldn't find in their dorms. The recently divorced mother of one of Tony's classmates, building a new life one meal at a time. "We'll need extra tables," Helen said, already mentally rearranging the dining room to accommodate everyone who wanted to join their extended family for the holiday. "Already ordered them," Emma replied, her organizational skills having evolved to match her mother's vision. "And Mrs. Chen is bringing her famous green bean dish, Francesco's providing wine at cost, and the high school culinary students are volunteering to serve." As Helen locked up that night, she paused to look through the window at the dining room that had become so much more than she'd originally envisioned. The mismatched chairs that Betty had insisted upon created intimate conversation nooks. The photographs of neighborhood history shared wall space with children's artwork and community announcements. The open kitchen design meant that cooking became performance, education, and invitation all at once. This was what belonging looked like. Not a seat granted at someone else's table, but a table of your own where everyone was welcome. Margaret Whitmore's cutting words from that terrible Thanksgiving had been meant to wound, to exclude, to diminish. Instead, they'd become the catalyst for something revolutionary. The radical act of creating inclusion rather than begging for acceptance. Helen's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the article about your Thanksgiving dinner in the community newsletter. Any chance you have room for one more? Recently moved to Boston, don't know anyone yet. Sarah?" Helen smiled, typing back, "Always room for one more at Nana's table." That's what we're here for. She walked home through the North End's narrow streets, past the church where her grandmother had prayed for her family's success, past the corner where she'd first seen Danny's food truck, and glimpsed the possibility of a different kind of belonging. The November air was crisp with promise, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of laughter from restaurants still serving late-night guests. At home in her small apartment, the same one she'd returned to in tears after that humiliating Thanksgiving, Helen pulled out the framed photograph Richard had given her on opening night. The young couple in the picture looked impossibly optimistic, unaware of the heartbreak and triumph that lay ahead. But Helen no longer mourned that earlier version of herself. That woman had needed others' approval to feel worthy. This woman had learned to create worth, to build belonging, to transform rejection into revolution. Tomorrow would bring the holiday that had once represented her deepest exclusion. This year, it would celebrate the community she'd built from the ashes of that humiliation. And as Helen fell asleep, she knew with perfect certainty that everyone who walked through Nana's table's doors would find exactly what she'd found, a place where they belonged, not because someone granted them permission, but because belonging was their birthright, and all they'd needed was someone to remind them. The circle was complete, the table was set, everyone was welcome. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,